Today we take a look at Mark's version of a very familiar miracle of Jesus. Interestingly, though, Mark is among the gospel writers was the only one who drew attention to a particular phrase which Jesus used to describe his motivation for performing that miracle. And it's the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And I've entitled my talk, Choose Your Shepherd. And it's based on Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. This scripture that we look at today invites us to think about guidance. Guidance is a tricky subject because most of us like to think that we are capable of making our own decisions. For instance, if I asked you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high, how high would you rate your ability to make independent life choices? Even though most of us would like to give ourselves a 10 for thinking independently, if we're honest, we will admit that we don't really make life decisions on our own. What we actually do is we base our life choices on the guidance we receive from the sources we choose to inform us. This means that when we discover that we have made a poor life choice, we can often trace that poor life choice back to having listened to the wrong source of guidance. It's why parents are concerned about the friends their children choose, because friends are a common source of guidance. Whether we're talking about developing relationships, about car troubles, about health issues, about financial investing, etc. The choices we make are highly dependent on the sources we turn to for guidance. We saw previously that Mark chapter 6 began by describing Jesus being rejected as a teacher and healer in his home community of Nazareth, and then with Jesus sending his 12 disciples out in pairs to become Jesus to needy people. And we were challenged to think about what it could mean for us to be Jesus to other people as well. By the time the disciples returned from that mission, something horrible had happened. You can read about it earlier in Mark's gospel, just before this section that we look at today. Herod Antipas, the ruler over Galilee, had John the Baptist executed in a very sordid manner. Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, who was the king of Israel when Jesus was born, and you may remember had all those babies killed, those male babies killed. Well, the apple hadn't fallen far from the tree, because during a birthday party for his stepdaughter, Herod was manipulated by his wife Herodias into having the head of John the Baptist brought into the dining hall on a serving platter of all things. It was a tragic reminder to Jesus' followers that no matter how much faith we exercise, we live in a world where evil is present. Because of that sad fact, combined with the stress the disciples experienced in their own ministry, Mark leads us to understand that the 12 disciples needed some alone time, probably to get guidance from Jesus. As we will see, that alone time was short-lived because Jesus saw that the crowds of people following him were also in desperate need of guidance. And so look for the reference to guidance as we read about this miraculous event recorded in Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. This is what it says. The apostles gathered round Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught on their mission, where they went out in pairs to represent Jesus to people. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because They were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, "5, and 2 fish." Then Jesus told them to make all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Did you catch the reference to guidance? Even though Jesus had intended to spend some quality time debriefing and giving his own guidance to his disciples in private, he had compassion on the crowds who followed him because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Throughout the Bible, the metaphor of a shepherd is used to represent guidance. We are familiar, for example, with the words, "The Lord is my shepherd," from Psalm 23, which describes God's comforting guidance during tough times. But what happens to people when there is no shepherd? Moses was the first person recorded in the Bible who raised that specter when he passed his leadership role to Joshua. Numbers 27:17 records Moses asking God to appoint a leader who would lead the people out and bring them in, so that the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. Again, that's in Numbers 27, verse 17. Sheep without a shepherd became a metaphor for people without guidance. It's a fitting image because sheep are among the animals most dependent on guidance. Without someone to guide them, sheep get lost. They fail to find food. If they are left alone, they overgraze an area. And they depend on people to have their wool shorn. That dependence on guidance doesn't mean sheep are completely stupid. Sheep are also known to have an exceptional ability to recognize people, allowing them to recognize their own shepherds so that they know whom to follow. In today's world, sheep is used as a derogatory term to refer to people who mindlessly follow others. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it does a disservice to sheep. Is it wise for each person to attempt to find their own way through life? Does it make sense for each person in a group of adventurers to carve their own path through a forest? The biblical metaphor about sheep and shepherds works because sheep know their limitations and depend on a shepherd to guide them. In the same way, wise people know their limitations and seek reputable sources for guidance in life. From the Bible's perspective, it's not a bad thing to be a sheep, but it is bad to be a sheep without a shepherd because it means that we are missing a reliable source of guidance. In this episode, Jesus' shepherding purpose was illustrated in several ways, but it always worked to bring people together. First, there was that brief but probably very meaningful journey in the boat where Jesus was able to spend time alone with his disciples. And even though that special time got interrupted, Jesus didn't forget about it. Because after the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, if you would read what happened after that in Mark chapter 6, Jesus sent his disciples off in a boat once again while he stayed behind to pray. And in another favorite miracle, Jesus would join the disciples by walking across the stormy water. Then, without ignoring the needs of his closest disciples, of the 12 disciples, Jesus taught the large crowd of people, proving that he cared for people's physical well-being in addition to their mental and physical welfare, in addition to their mental and spiritual welfare. Jesus arranged for the people to all be fed before they returned home. As much as we love the story about a young boy's lunch being miraculously multiplied to feed thousands of people and ending with 12 baskets of leftovers, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that Mark's telling of the miracle begins with the awareness of a lack of guidance. It all started with Jesus noticing that the people were like sheep without a shepherd. They were people who had lost their sense of guidance. The issue of guidance in our time is one that has gotten increasingly complicated, as illustrated by attempting to identify our own news sources. Not so many years ago, we pretty much all got our news from the same basic source. For us as Canadians, we relied on the CBC for national and international news, and we relied on our hometown newspapers to provide us with local news stories. When I was born, which granted was more than a few years ago, Canada didn't even have CTV as an alternative national news service. Today, it's possible that in a room full of people, each person would give a different response for their personal source for news. We throw around terms like mainstream media, alternative media, media bias, media misinformation, and media influencers, providing a menu of choices for how we interpret the news. People end up debating, and not always in kind ways, what is fake and real news and on which side the conspiracies lie. Studies indicate that over half of people get their news from social media. If that's true, it means that most Canadians would rather trust their social media friends on their favorite media or their favorite media influencer for news rather than what was once considered a reliable news source, the CBC. And all of this creates a problem in how we relate to people within our local communities and even within our churches. By narrowing our trusted sources for guidance down to our personal connections, our society has developed a huge distrust of one another. We end up not even trusting the people we used to trust because we distrust their personal sources. Sadly, we are in danger of being like sheep without a shepherd. So how do we measure or evaluate whether our lives receive constructive guidance? In other words, how do we know that we are following the right shepherd? Here are some suggestions. One suggestion is that we have a sense of eternal purpose. Jesus was always about the long-term view. When we know that our lives have meaning beyond our present life, we aren't quite so likely to fall victim to those who have a short-term view. Another suggestion is that our souls are being fed. As a shepherd, Jesus was concerned that people were fed, their whole being, their physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being. Having our souls fed means that we experience an internal satisfaction with our life purpose. Another suggestion for knowing that we receive constructive guidance, that we are following the right shepherd, is that we end up connecting to the right people. Just like a shepherd brings a flock together, constructive guidance will connect us with the right people. The feeding of the 5,000 highlights how Jesus brought people together. You know, it's not bad to be a sheep. It's only bad to be a sheep without a shepherd.